we're actually gonna start on time, which is sort of incredible. And this is like the most exciting thing that I've done so far today. So I guess like, is everybody, all our panelists, everybody good to go? Nobody needs, if you need water or like to pet your dog, do so now, and then we'll get rolling here.
A cat will probably wander through at some point, but we're good.
I hope so. For your benefit, I hope so.
Yeah, that's just, it's part of the deal, I think. That's mostly why we asked you all to be here. We want to see your pets as they appear. Cool. Well, okay. So just to kick things off here, my name's David Pierce. I'm the editor-at-large at Protocol, and this is our first virtual meetup. This is sort of a grand experiment in what it looks like to get a bunch of people we like together and get to know each other and talk about the stuff that matters in this world. And obviously there's a lot of stuff that matters in this world right now. And I feel like we're all in the sort of rare experience of like, everybody is dealing with the same thing at the same time. And it's the top of everyone's mind. And so we're going to dig in and talk about it. Let's see, you should all introduce yourselves. It's easier if you do that than me. And let's see, we're just going to go in order of how I see you on my screen. So Lauren, why don't you go first?
Yeah, my name's Lauren Hepler. I'm a Silicon Valley reporter for Protocol. I've been spending the last couple of weeks talking to both executives who are dealing with how to manage a crisis for their workforce, but also gig workers, Tesla workers, people that are still in offices during this crazy time. So really looking forward to all of your thoughts on what this means as we move forward.
Cool. Okay, Andrew, you're up next.
So I'm Andrew Chamberlain. I'm the chief economist at Glassdoor, the job site. I've been in this role for about 5 years. I run the research group at Glassdoor, and I've been a labor economist for about 15 years. So this won't be the first recession I've been through. So I can help answer general questions about when to be scared and when not to and so forth.
Perfect. I think we have lots of those. Okay, Noelle, you're up.
Hi, I'm Noelle Tassey. I am the new CEO of Alley. We're a workspace and innovation company based out of New York, but we have locations across the country. And I've been talking to Lauren a lot over the last 2 weeks about what's going on and how this is impacting, especially the New York startup community and our communities in DC and Cambridge as well.
Awesome. All right, Stephane, what do you got?
So I think my Twitter profile now says I'm a remote work expert. Started way before remote work was cool, so that's what I do. I've been in tech since '98, so this is actually my third recession. I've done the 2001 collapse, I've done 2008, 2009, and now I'm seeing the disaster that 2020 looks out to be. Most recently, I was the CEO of a company called Upwork, which is the largest marketplace for freelance work. So we help companies find developers, designers, consultants, lawyers, etc. in the US and throughout the world. I'm also involved with the World Economic Forum, where and this is really fancy, I'm the co-chair for the Global Future Council on Gender Equality and Work, meaning we're trying to figure out how to fix education, diversity in general and gender parity in particular, and work, small topic. And I'm also right now involved with the state of California. The governor has created a commission on the future of work. So I'm one of 12 commissioners on that. And then in addition to all of this, I'm no longer the CEO of Upwork, so I'm not involved with the company. So I do a little bit of angel investment. I sit on a few boards of tech companies, and I'm advising about a dozen companies in this space right now.
Very cool. Me. Okay, and Peter, last but not least.
Hey everybody, Peter Leroe-Muñoz. I serve as General Counsel and SVP of Tech and Innovation Policy for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We're a trade association representing about 330 member companies in the innovation economy.
Awesome, cool. Well, again, thank all of you for being here. And basically the idea for this is to be as let's just have a conversation. Like, please interrupt each other and yell at each other and tell me I'm an idiot. And like, please, the more we just talk, the better this will be. And also to everyone who is listening but doesn't have a microphone, first of all, I'm very sorry, no offense. But you can ask questions. There's a Q&A thing in Zoom, and you can ask questions, and Lauren and I think some of the other panelists are looking at them, and so we will answer them as they go. So if you have questions, drop them in there. And basically the rough idea of what I want to talk about today, and what I think we all have interesting perspectives on, is basically we're sort of at this moment where the way everyone works is changing, right? There are people who are working from home and have gotten used to new work habits. There are people who are losing their jobs. There are people whose jobs don't exist anymore. There are people whose total life change is happening. And I feel like we're at this moment where at some point, hopefully in the near future, this sort of immediate health scare is going to go away. So I think what I'm particularly interested in, what I hope we can talk a lot about, is what happens now that affects the future. Like what about what's changing now is going to matter in 6 months and a year and in 5 years and in 10 years, long after coronavirus stops being the first thing. And to me, there are two sides of that, right? There's the people whose jobs are going to change, and there's the people whose jobs are going to totally disappear and are going to have to figure out a whole new way of working, and companies that are going to have to figure out how to respond to that. But let's start on the sort of work from home people whose jobs and habits are shifting. And Andrew, I actually want to start with you because I feel like this is a thing that you've been looking into a lot. And one thing I wonder is, are people ever going to go back to work? We have millions of people who are now working from home. And I've been reading all these surveys that say people who work from home never want to go back to the office. So is this just life now for all these people?
Oh, for every person who says they never want to go back to the office, I bet you can find somebody who can't wait to get out of their house. So I'll start with the research. So we've done some research on Glassdoor looking at benefit availability. Who has access to work from home benefits? And we collect data on this. And it's over the last decade, the access to work from home has doubled about. So back in 2010, 2011, about 1/4 of workers said they had access to work from home. Now it's more than 50%. So it is a big increase, but it's not 90%. So my opinion is so the labor market works it moves very slowly or not at all during good times. And during bad times, the system takes a shock, and then things change potentially in big ways forever because we're forced to get out of our comfort zone. So I do think you're going to see a permanent uptick in remote work. But will most of the labor market end up remote? Absolutely not. For most workers in wholesale trade or transportation or healthcare or construction engineering, there's no way most of those jobs can feasibly be done from home. They require in-person interaction. And you have to remember, for 10,000 years, human beings have been working in teams of a few dozen to a few hundred. That's our sweet spot, and that's what makes us so innovative. And I think there's really never going to be a full substitute for FaceTime. I just think you're going to see institutions change, maybe more aggressive sick leave policies, and maybe more attention to germ control and cleanliness, things like that.
Okay. Noelle, I'm curious, given that you are very much in the middle of this world of co-working, unconventional workspaces, what are you seeing in terms of like new types of programming that are being added? In one instance, I think you had said this is kind of like a forcing mechanism to like more actively get involved in some of these things that had maybe been an option in the past, but now are essential.
Yeah, definitely. I think for a long time, we've talked about incorporating digital community into what we do, right? I think part of the benefit of being part of an accelerator, a lab, or some sort of shared community space, especially as an early stage startup, is there are things that you just can't do when you're running a company and you've got 4 employees and you're trying to figure out how to get to, your next fundraising round. And so maybe sometimes that's, plan a holiday party, which we do for you, we're just going to have one and you'll be part of it. But sometimes that can be things like day-to-day communication through Slack and building community in that way. So for us, it's something we've had on our radar for a while, and this has really redoubled our efforts in terms of focusing on how do we utilize tools like Slack across all of our member companies? How do we get people engaged on digital hangouts like this one? How do we move more of our panels online? We have locations across the country, and we actually have, for a while, had the technology set up so that we could have joint remote events between our communities, like in the space. So Cambridge and New York have cameras and walls of screens that could connect, and you could, in theory, do a panel in both locations. And this is something that, frankly, we've laid the groundwork to do. And then I think coming out of this will be the sort of thing that we'll be really ready to embrace, having done a bunch of digital panels for the community and sort of created channels for engagement that way. I also think, frankly, people are less shy about talking to each other in like this sort of setting where it's a little bit more peer-to-peer and you're clearly here to talk to somebody about something as opposed to like your office happy hour. So we're kind of seeing that as a real value add actually in terms of this shift. And I hope to bring that back into more of our physical community whenever we resume operations.
That's interesting. I feel like for years, people were like terrified to get on video chats, and you had to get, you know, it became this like very formal thing. Like I still have to schedule video calls with my family because if I just call, there's like this huge panic. But it is true. It does seem like one thing that has happened in the last couple of weeks is that everyone has gotten a whole lot more comfortable with the idea of just sort of like being together in a space like this. Have you guys felt that too?
Yeah. I think FaceTime's done a lot for that too.
Yeah, that's fair. So Stephane, I'm curious from your perspective, it feels like Andrew and Noelle are saying, a lot of these things have sort of been happening over time anyway. And it feels like we've been on this sort of trajectory towards remote and distributed work being possible. But now, like, is what's happening now, is coronavirus just speeding that up, sort of 10xing that process that was already happening? Or is there something fundamentally different that is happening now? I'm actually curious what all of you think.
What Andrew said, right? It's a shock in the system. I mean, I would say, somewhat in a sobering way, I've been pushing this for a decade, and the virus did more in a month than I've done in 10 years. So it's a little bit sobering. But I think the upside of this is we will come out of this with a better way for people to live. Like, not everybody has to live in San Francisco, in New York, where all the jobs are, but where it's completely unaffordable to live and be stuck in traffic. You know, Americans spend more days in traffic than on vacation every year. Nothing really good comes out of that. You know, it's unsafe, we get accidents, it's terrible for pollution and the environment and climate change and all that stuff. So I think we can emerge from this with an acceleration towards a better way of working, where it's more flexible hours, it's more flexible on location, and the interaction between companies and the workers is more designed for the 21st century and less stuck in this idea of the assembly line of the 20th century, which is what the big office tower has become. But we're being forced into this. It's happening way faster than anybody's comfortable with. We all have kids at home, so we're much less productive. The tools may or may not be ready. Like, you know, we all equipped here. Clearly, everybody has a laptop and everybody has a good broadband connection at home and everybody has a decent webcam. I can tell you, I was just chatting with two consultants that are doing work for, one for the US government and the other one for the Canadian government. And a lot of these employees have desktops in the office. They don't have access to a laptop. Go try to order 100,000 laptops on Dell right now and see what happens. They don't have VPN access. They don't have tools in the cloud. And so for them, they're being told, like, go work at home, but you can't work at home. And so I think the downside of this crisis is a lot of people and companies might emerge from this saying, this is a failed experiment. It was a forced experiment. It's not something we chose, but we tried and it was a disaster. Productivity went down. People were upset. And so the fastest we can move back to the old ways, the better it's going to be. And there's a long history of this stuff. You know, IBM notoriously was probably the first company to push remote work back in the 1980s, completely backed out of it in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And their conclusion was it doesn't work. And the point being, it doesn't work under certain conditions and it works in others. But when people are not given a choice, they're more likely than not going to react by feeling like it was imposed on them. They're feeling like, you know, victims of the situation, as opposed to, wow, this is amazing, I get the opportunity. And if you add on top of that a lot of angst, you know, people are extremely worried, and frankly, rightly so, about potentially losing their jobs or, you know, other things happening in their life, potentially people that they're close to, catching the virus and being really sick. I mean, there's a lot of fear associated with the current environment that probably in people's minds is going to be associated with remote work. So I would say I'm not super bullish that we're going to come out of this net with an acceleration of it. Clearly, it's accelerated right now. I mean, if you look at Google Maps at peak hour in the Bay Area, everything is green. It hasn't happened since, you know, like the 1980s or something. But I'm not sure that coming out of it, people will feel that this is the new way to go, despite the fact that for a lot of people, it's a better life, you know. And I would say, specifically the population that we used to serve at Upwork, or that I used to serve, but Upwork continues to serve, 50% of the freelancers in the US, who are, you know, one of the big work from home populations, say that they can't take a full-time job either because they have physical disabilities, mental health issues, like veterans with PTSD, people with Asperger, you know, all sorts of things that make the office environment completely unbearable, care duties, or that they live in a part of the country where there's no jobs, right? And so for a lot of people, it's a huge enabler. And we really want companies to be promoting this because it helps with diversity and it helps with social inequality, and it helps in all sorts of ways. But it's clearly not for everybody, including the fact that, as Andrew said, most of the jobs in the US still require on-site presence anyway.
Right. That's really fascinating. And it reminds me, Peter, of a lot of the work you do at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, where you're thinking about sort of these broader sort of day-to-day realities for workers, where in the Bay Area, we think constantly about housing affordability, about crazy commutes. So I'm just curious what you're hearing, and in particular, if this is hitting big and small companies differently, just sort of how these variables are coming together.
Yeah, so Lauren, thank you for raising that. So among our 330 member companies, housing and transportation and the challenges associated with those two are among the biggest concerns that our member companies have, recognizing that this is not just simply a quality of life issue, but it's a bottom line economic impact issue, in that it's incredibly hard to attract and retain the talent you need if people can afford to live somewhere else, or they can afford not to have to drive as long as they are just trying to get to work. What we've seen, what I think has been really interesting, and Stephane, I thought you brought up a really interesting point about the dynamic between employers and employees. What we're really seeing among our companies, but even more broadly throughout the economy, is that there's really been kind of almost a recalibration, if you will, between managers and those who are managed, in the sense that when you go to this work remote environment for an extended period of time, it really puts a great deal of power in the hands of the employees. Managers can't manage by sight anymore. You have to do it by performance and by output. And so I think in some ways, what we're already starting to see is that employees are becoming more and more empowered. For those who are able to work remotely, a lot of them have the tools, and they're certainly not shy about reaching out to colleagues, as Noelle had mentioned. So I think what we're seeing is, again, some of the companies are really recognizing that this balance of power is tipping a little bit towards employees who are now working remotely.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that, Noelle, at Alley? I mean, just having to sort of manage this as a CEO, a new CEO. Noelle, we spoke last Monday when she became the CEO. So interesting timing in all of this, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I never dreamed of shutting down most of our operations on my second day in the job, but here we are.
Crazy.
Timing is everything. You know, I think what we're actually seeing on our team, you know, it's sort of another side to that. I think I really agree in terms of the shift in the power dynamic is I think a lot of managers have had teams that are capable of a high level of accountability, but there's never been a forcing mechanism to put structures in place. And all of a sudden you have to manage a team remotely. You can't just be talking to everybody all day about what they're doing. And through that forcing mechanism, I think what that makes you do as a manager is just step up and be better, frankly. And you can really trust your team to do their work in a remote setting, which is really cool. I think that's been fun for us to see. We've been working on putting a lot of process in place around accountability, project management. It's just a big thing for our team because we're already distributed and we're just an incredibly cross-functional organization. So that is just key to getting anything done. But then to be able to do that remotely has been really interesting. And I think, you know, we're going to have a much more empowered team on the other side of this because of that. And as a manager, I'm not going to feel, you know, like I need to breathe down everyone's necks.
And you know, that's been like one of the biggest concerns people have had about remote work historically, and also one of the biggest myths, right? So the typical concern is, how do I know that they're working? Which, by the way, hints at how do you know how to manage? Because managing by objectives was always a better way of doing it than managing by FaceTime. But that aside, what every study has ever found, including the ones that, you know, we were running at Upwork, is that it tends to be the opposite. So remote workers tend to work a lot more than people who come on site. And in fact, the real issue is the opposite, which is burnout. And I think, you know, and that's why, you know, co-working spaces like what, you know, Noelle is working on is so important, because remote work does not mean work from home. And it definitely doesn't mean work from your living room, where you can't separate your professional life from your personal life. And in a time where we're always connected and push notifications happen 24 hours a day, that leads to people working a lot more hours and being a lot more socially isolated and a lot more burnt out. So the myth is people work less when they're at home. The reality is they tend to work a lot more. And so, yes, managers should learn to manage by objectives and do OKRs and what have you, and get involved, you know, when needed, but also should learn to understand, you know, have empathy and understand when people are struggling mentally, because the last thing you're going to want is a workforce that is burnt out and mentally depressed. And, it's bad enough with the virus right now and everybody's being scared of everything. I think if managers should completely change the mindset from, let me check on people to make sure that they're working, to a completely different mindset, which is, let me check on how they're doing and what I can do to help them be, successful and at peace with what's going on in their life.
Yeah, that goes back to something. Oh, sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, when people think about how much remote work will grow in the future, usually the focus is on the infrastructure. They say, well, there's Zoom meetings and there's Slack, and so those things make it possible. But what I often don't hear people talk about are what's missing from a lot of remote work, which is the personal relationships and emotional connections between people in the workplace that you get in person that are really hard to build with Slack and Zoom and other things. So for certain jobs, having personal friendship relationships with people makes teams work better because people do each other favors behind the scenes and they go out of their way to help people out when it's not one of their direct objectives, and it just makes things smoother. And so having a strong business culture, like making sure all of your employees are on the same page and have an extremely strong set of marching orders that everybody's on the same page with the culture, is a really important thing to think about for building an effective remote workplace. But also the tools that are being built today, we've got to find better ways for people to connect emotionally. And having emojis on Slack helps. Like, think about the difference between writing a note to someone with a smiley face versus not. Like, you help, you create empathy and you form friendship relationships with people that way. So I think that stuff is really important to build, because there still is a really significant bias against remote work culturally in most organizations, even in tech. All the time I hear people say, well, we can't promote so-and-so because they're fully remote and they'll never really be able to manage or deal with subtle lobbying behind the scenes when you're not in meetings and so forth. So I think those are really the issues we have to crack if you want to see more remote work in more mainstream jobs.
And by the way, like, one thing I would say is every big fully distributed company, like Upwork has 2,000 team members, of which about 1,700 work from home. But there's like a dozen companies that are at least a couple hundred, if not a couple thousand team members that are, either completely distributed or mostly distributed. And you do a lot of FaceTime. You have to. And right now we can't because we're all stuck at home. But once the epidemic is over and we can travel again, one of the best practices that every one of those companies uses is to do meetups. And so you don't necessarily fly 2,000 people in Istanbul because that's, it's a big boondoggle, it's expensive. And frankly, nobody wants to be surrounded by 2,000 people. At least people like me who are introverted do not want that. But you do a lot of small group meetups, like an agile development team of 20 people spending a week in Madrid, or, and it's a huge perk for a lot of people. It's like, oh my God, this company is paying for me to travel to cool places and hang out with some of my coworkers. And the thing that we've always found is it's almost like, the level of emotional relationship when you're isolated like this goes down over time slowly. And then you meet up and it goes back up sharply. And then it, trickles down again. And so meeting up every 12 to 18 months with people that you, get to interact with the rest of the year ends up being a pretty good compromise.
Yeah, from an economist standpoint, you'd say that FaceTime and virtual work are complements rather than substitutes.
Right. That sounds much better than
I'd have to sneak in. They take away my economist license if I don't sneak in some jargon.
So and Josh Turner, who's on the line here, asked a question that is something I've been thinking a lot about too. He said, "What about Steve Jobs' notion of moments of serendipity? Is that now irrelevant?" And that's the thing I've been wondering a lot about too. And we've been talking about even at Protocol, so much of what's great about what we do just comes from a bunch of people sort of sitting in a room and random things happen and you run into each other and you talk to new people. And especially and I'm thinking about people who are new to jobs. We've hired people who have literally never met in person any of the people that they work with. So do you guys feel like, are we learning how to do this stuff? Is it even possible to learn how to do that stuff? Or are we just going to have to pause all that until we can be in a room together?
I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at this just because
Sure.
we've been struggling with this or dealing with this for 2 decades at Upwork. the tools are not ideal, right? Like, and I think, by the way, like there's probably an entire generation of entrepreneurs right now that are building the next generation remote work tools, because when you're stuck at home doing Zoom all day long and you have an entrepreneurial mindset, you're like, ooh, this is broken, or this is, you know, something I can do. So I think like we can have that discussion again in a couple of years when all these tools are out, and my guess is there's going to be a ton of innovation. But it is true that remote work historically works better in an environment where everybody knows what they're supposed to be working on, and everybody's mostly executing on their own. And there are some jobs where that is 100% of what the job is about. And for those, frankly, being stuck in an office where there's potentially noise and you don't control your environment and all that stuff has almost no upside whatsoever. And if you want the social connection, you go in a co-working space. But there are jobs which are much more about ideation, much more about serendipity, much more about collaboration. And for those, building the right tools really matters. And, you know, like you get to learn to do the best with the tools you have. Like Slack is pretty good, and Google Docs is really good, and Zoom is really good. And those things don't talk to each other as well as they could, but they generally, you make it work. But it is true that, you know, in a highly ambiguous environment where you're really trying to figure out what you want to do next, the Meetup where you rent an Airbnb and everybody's doing, you know, brainstorming on Post-it notes and whiteboards during the day is still like a really, really good way of doing it.
Fair enough. So, okay. So I think I want to be conscious of everybody's time. So let's switch gears a little bit. And let's talk about like the gig workers and the contract workers and sort of the other side of the economy that is, I think, being hit much harder, frankly, than all of the people who are now just able to work from home. So Lauren, I know you've been reporting on this for years now, and I feel like there's really interesting history that comes into this. Like, will you sort of catch us up to like this present moment in time in terms of how the labor force is changing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of history, but there's also like just things that have happened in the last couple of months that are colliding now are just pretty crazy, frankly. So in California, we have Assembly Bill 5, which was this massive legislative effort. There's some criticism from a lot of corners. A lot of people are very strong supporters to change the classification of gig workers to full-time employees. And that is now suspended in legal limbo at this time when we're seeing like massive reliance on delivery drivers. In particular, there's been a push by labor unions like this week that we've been hearing about for Lyft, Uber, Postmates, DoorDash, all of the usual suspects to liquidate a $110 million campaign fund they have to challenge that bill and give it directly to their workers. So sort of like a gig economy bailout. So I think we're going to hear a lot more about that type of thing in the next few weeks, months, however long this goes on. But then on the big tech company side, I'd be really curious to get the opinion of somebody like Peter on this. I think this is just a really crazy window into kind of the infrastructure of tech companies that you don't usually get. They're not just, we hear a lot about the perks for full-time employees, but there's also tons of hourly workers. There are temps, there are contractors of all different stripes. And the companies are having to sort of calibrate their response to something like this tailored to each of those groups. And I've been talking to workers who were being like, oh, I'm falling through the cracks in this way the last couple of weeks in a lot of instances. So I'm curious what you all think, just sort of in terms of whether it's your own company or what you're hearing from others about how you sort of manage through the ranks of a company. And then if anyone has thoughts on the question of gig work and just sort of how contractors play into the future of work as well.
Yeah, Lauren, I can start the discussion around that. I mean, from our perspective, we were very active in terms of addressing AB5 and its impact to the innovation economy in a lot of different areas. And in the interest of full disclosure, Lyft, Uber, and other on-demand service companies are our clients. So that's kind of where we're coming from. You know, looking at what we've seen through the last several weeks, the reliance on these kind of on-demand services, as you can imagine, we've all seen, has just gone through the roof. And that's completely understandable. And I think it underscores kind of the need for preserving this kind of work and the flexibility that allows workers to engage in this kind of activity. One of the challenges with AB5 that we saw last year is that it really does remove that choice from workers who actually want to engage in this kind of work and are using it as a supplement for other types of work that they already engage in. So we're seeing that. With regard to the request by unions to liquidate the campaign funds, I don't know if that's going to be in the offing, but we'll certainly wait to see. I'll reserve any kind of comment or judgment on that. I also know as well that there is a lawsuit right now that's being worked its way through the court system in California, which would actually temporarily suspend, or not temporarily suspend, but ensure that the strictures of AB5 don't apply to those on-demand companies. So this is something it was already crazy to begin with. There was already a political effort in terms of addressing AB5. There was also a legal effort, and now we've kind of see this as how people are relying on it even more so than they were before. So I think, given the prominence of on-demand services and kind of everybody's life as we're all kind of quarantined, I think it's gonna be very interesting to see the emphasis placed on gig workers kind of going forward. I mean, I think we now have to kind of view them in this kind of circumstance almost like an essential service, similar to whether it's supermarkets or hospitals or other kind of things. This is really now an essential component of everyday life and business.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know we've been getting comments from companies like Instacart and DoorDash over the last couple of weeks that say they're already seeing people who anecdotally have been laid off as a result of this downturn and are now immediately going into these new jobs at a gig work company. So, I mean, if that becomes like a recurring phenomenon, I think would be interesting. Andrew, on the job side, like, where are we with data to understand kind of how much the gig economy has already changed the workforce, and how that might change moving forward?
There's been a lot of research on this recently. So the overall magnitude of what people call the gig economy depends on how you measure it, but it's relatively small as an overall part of the labor force. And the way an economist thinks about gig work is from a simple economic point of view. The question is really, why aren't we all gig workers? Like, that's the puzzle most economists might pose, is why would we ever have firms where we have lots of people working inside organizations? Why isn't it just one big free market where every individual person is their own firm? And this is a really old question in economics, and the answer to it is really is why companies exist at all, is because for certain types of jobs, gig work works really well, but for some jobs it will probably never work. So the jobs where gig work or contract work is really effective are jobs where most parts of the job are observable, or they're for discrete tasks, relatively simple transactions for the most part. A ride across town is like the perfect example, a short-term rental of a unit, maybe a graphic design job that has like really specific criteria for completion. But lots of jobs are not like that. Lots of jobs have lots of unobservable characteristics to them. They're hard to measure, they're hard to observe, and they depend on trust and long-term relationships. So maybe a doctor, maybe some engineer who builds like the most important parts of your infrastructure for your web platform or something. Those are jobs like, you don't really see that moving to a gig economy platform because it's just too risky and there's too many uncertainties involved. And, like, for example, when you guys organized this panel today, like, why did you call us rather than post an ad on a gig platform for 5 experts on tech and the economy? You did it because, like, you don't really know fully what you're getting all the time through a gig platform. So my perspective on the gig economy is, like, many of the low-hanging fruit have already been picked. Like, the jobs that are really easy to push out to a gig platform have been done, and I don't see much massive growth going on in the future. I think it's here to stay, and it definitely solves a problem for real people, for sure. People who are looking to fill in the gaps in employment, and people who are stay-home parents and just want to work on the side and want flexibility. But I think the hype has been overblown. I think that there's never really going to be most of us working in a gig economy setup. We just have too much of a legal and institutional and regulatory framework around the labor market. Like, for a century, we've been building like progressive policy to curb the powerful influence of employers and protect workers. And what's happening today with the rise of gig work is it's running head on into 100 years of public policy designed for employers who have lots of bargaining power and workers who have none. And a lot of historical cases of workers really getting a bad deal as a result. So that's the reason why we have so much controversy today.
Noelle, what do you make of all of this? I feel like you're at sort of an interesting perspective of both running a company, but also seeing sort of the people who are in alley spaces trying to make their own way as companies and freelancers and stuff like that. Like, what are you seeing?
Sure. So, I mean, with regards to our business, we do not have a lot of people. I don't think we actually have anybody right now who's in a contract role, aside from like freelancers that we'll use just on the one-off kind of task basis. So we do work with like illustrators through 99 Designs and things like that, but we try to source most of those workers just through our community, since we're a community-based business. I think the other side to what's happening now is you see that a lot of workers, and I think in New York especially, where so much of the culture is around restaurants and eating out, you're seeing a lot of workers who are in hourly jobs or sort of more tip-driven roles getting furloughed. And that's obviously just gutting New York. And it's really, really sad to see. And that is something that we've run into head on, right? Running Alley involves a lot of hourly, part-time work. You've got your community managers who are working with the community, front of house, and those are hospitality roles. They know everybody, they're walking around talking to everybody, they're petting your dog, they're learning about your company, they're delivering your packages, they're making the coffee, they're doing it all. And, something that we decided really early on in this, and this actually gets back to, I think, the culture piece we were talking about earlier when we were talking about remote work and how it's really about building a culture where people feel valued and they can collaborate and they feel like safe and they trust the business. So something that we decided really early on was, one way or another, we're not going to furlough anybody. We're just going to ride it out. We're going to white knuckle it. But that's kind of the commitment that we've made to our team. Top to bottom is nobody's wages are going to get touched. Nobody's benefits get touched. This is a really bad time to be uninsured. So we're trying to set that example, and hopefully as many companies in our community as possible will be doing the same. But it's also just a really hard time to be a startup. And I think that the entire venture ecosystem has kind of encouraged at the early pre-revenue stages kind of a cost structure that makes it really, really hard to sustain those commitments during downturns like this. We're in an industry, frankly, where, if you look at the elephant in the room is WeWork, that's kind of the poster child for an unsustainable business model. And that was evident as early as a year and a half ago when I joined Alley as the COO. And the first decision that we made after that was, this company has to be sustainable. It really has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. This is not an industry where a venture-backed business model really works. And so we worked really hard to get there over the last year and a half. And we thought it was a smart decision at the time. Now we feel like geniuses, but yeah.
So, and I mean, that goes, that we actually have a question in the chat that I feel like comes to some of this too, which is the question's from Lauren Kwan, and it says, do you think coronavirus outbreak will force a rethink of how we value and compensate essential jobs from medical professionals to teachers and gig workers? Which, I mean, like, I don't know about you guys, but I keep seeing all these tweets from parents whose kids are suddenly home being like, oh my God, every teacher should be a billionaire. And I think that this goes, I mean, it goes for, I had this sort of existential crisis last night ordering dinner. It's like, if I do DoorDash, how much do I have to tip in order to make this feel sort of ethically correct? And it does feel like in this moment, we are in the middle of trying to rethink, like, to what you were saying before, Andrew, kind of what these people mean in our lives and in the world. And I think it's bigger than anybody realizes in a lot of ways. So like, are we going to come out of this with some sort of fundamentally different model, even if the work doesn't change, for how we take care and compensate people? I mean, we're talking about paid sick leave and all of these things that are just becoming, along with AB5 and stuff like that, these are becoming sort of bigger and bigger conversations. And I feel like it's an even starker relief now.
I'm happy to
go.
Take it. I would say there's kind of the short term and then the long term. The short term is we just need a big bailout, right? Like, this is not the time for debate on, is AB5 a good idea? Is the gig economy going to grow? Like people need to pay their bills in 2 weeks, and we need like emergency, money. And it's not, just the gig workers, which is a tiny percentage of the labor force, right? If you're a temp and you're fully employed, you get a W-2, but by a staffing firm who has much lower levels of protection than a, Google as an example, you're going to be in trouble. If you're a small business, by the way, like the vast majority of small businesses in the US have one employee, meaning it's self-employed, so it's gig work. You're also going to be, in big trouble. And so we can have long-term debates about social safety nets and, how do we value work in this country. But in the meantime, like this is not the time for debate, right? This is the time for cash in people's pockets so that they can pay their bill. Because otherwise it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like people are going to start defaulting on their bills. They're going to file for personal bankruptcy. They're going to get evicted. And that trickles down like even, further incidents in the economy. Now, long-term, I hope we come out of this with a real public debate around market failures in our economy. The whole debate around AB5, which was solved in a different way in the UK and was solved in a different way in many EU countries, is a much bigger debate, which is people want to work in certain ways, and there should be some minimum agreed upon set of protections, irrespective of what kind of employment contract you have, right? And so the idea that you don't, like for instance in the US, you pay as a independent worker, you pay the two sides of Social Security. So you pay twice as much Social Security as a full-time employee, and yet you get a lot fewer protections. That doesn't make a ton of sense, right? But having the bigger debate around when the market is failing, meaning like there's an oversupply of certain types of workers and therefore rates tend to go down, or some rates are decided by the government, like public education, the rates are defined by, public institutions. So they are not necessarily correlated with what the private market would be doing. And so in cases where the market is failing, we need to put policies into place to try to get to an outcome that is more aligned with what we want. And fundamentally, if something is very valuable to society, it should be paid, in a valuable way. One thing that we've been trying to do with the World Economic Forum for a very long time now is unpaid care work. This is hugely valuable to society. I mean, raising children is probably, in the long run, the most important thing we can do. Like if they're highly educated, they'll do well and they'll grow the economy and they'll pay for our retirement and we'll all be fine. And if they don't, then it's going to be a disaster. And yet most care work in most countries is unpaid. And even when it's paid through an informal economy, which typically comes with very, very few protections. And in a down cycle like this, tends to be the first jobs that go away. And so I think, again, this is not the time for debate. This is the time for just throwing money at the problem and help make sure that people are not completely screwed in the next few months. But coming out of this, we do need to have a national debate. And frankly, some of it should be inspired by what's happening in other countries, right? I mean, there's, again, the work we've done with the World Economic Forum, there's tons of benchmarks around what Denmark does and what Germany does and what Switzerland does and many other countries which have an economy that's just as strong as ours, where all of the happiness indexes and the competitive indexes are much higher than they are for ours, and which just have better social protection. And we keep wanting to not have the debate, it feels like, and we keep to be super polarized with, not to talk about politics, but a Bernie Sanders on one extreme and a Donald Trump on the other. And yet there's tons of examples in the middle that seem to be working quite well in other countries.
Okay. Anybody else agree, disagree?
I mean, I agree that there's a big short-term disruption that's going to require bailout and crisis management. But in the long run, what people earn is basically a result of a labor supply and labor demand, right? And so for teachers, for example, like you're never really going to see wages systematically rise unless there's far fewer teachers or demand for them massively rises. So all of the wage rates you see around the economy before this crisis, they reflect like the way our world is organized, which is an intensely socially connected and in-person world. If we maintained a shelter-in-place regulation for months and years, like it would require a radical reorganization of just everything about human civilization. So it's not sustainable, and that will not happen. Instead, what you'll see things changing on the margin, like different emphasis on the way we organize childcare, say, or the way we organize healthcare and pandemic response. But I think it's always tempting during a crisis to think everything is different forever from now on. But the reality is in the long run, like you're going to see a few small things change here and there. but ultimately, 5 and 10 years from now, we're going to be looking back and seeing that this was a disruption and largely things go back to or equilibrium. There was a good reason why they were organized the way they were to begin with.
Can I say that I both totally agree and totally disagree with Andrew? So I totally agree that this is likely the outcome, right? We all survive from this and we go back to our day-to-day lives and nothing changes. To me, that's a very big missed opportunity, not a desirable outcome. And by the way, there will be a COVID 2025 or a COVID something else. It's going to happen again. And if it's not a pandemic, it's going to be some other big shock in the economy. And I think a more positive outcome to me would be that we learn from what's happening today and we make changes. It is not a given that teachers have to be underpaid because there are too many teachers and not enough demand for teachers. Take Iceland as an example, and everybody always says, yeah, but Iceland is a small country. Okay, fine. Iceland is not a smaller country than many states in the US. The top university graduates in Iceland go become teachers. Why? Because it's highly valued by society. And by the way, they're much better paid, partly because there's a lot less of a wage gap in that country than there is here in the US. These are choices that societies make. It's choices that politicians make, like where taxpayers' money goes. It could go a lot more to public education than it does today. And if it did, for the same number of teachers, they would get paid a lot more money. And the same is true for the care economy. The same is true for many other parts of the economy. As individuals, there's very little you can do about it. But as a society, you completely control this stuff. We don't have to be the victims of the equilibrium of the economy. Like, we get to be actors of the equilibrium, and we get to shape it in whatever way we want. And the laws of supply and demand are just one type of law, and we have our own laws, and we can do whatever we want with them.
Okay, well, we can't, I was going to say we're already over time, so we can't, so we'll end here, but we can't end talking about COVID 2025. That's a bummer of a last thing to talk about. So let's, I have one more question, and then I will let all of you go. Thank you for being here with us as long as you have. And I want to kind of fast forward, whether it's 3 months or 6 months or a year from now, and look a little bit at the job market. So we're in this place where tons of people are getting laid off, people are getting furloughed, jobs are changing, jobs are disappearing. But we're going to get to a point where if we come out of this, right, if you're running a company, you're going to potentially have new ways of thinking about hiring and recruiting in a more remote workforce. If you're an economist, you're going to have to figure out what in the world we're going to do with all of these millions of people who now suddenly need a job. If you're Uber, you're about to have to rehire all these drivers who couldn't afford to work for you for a long time. So I'm curious, kind of from each of your perspectives, like fast forward to when we're all allowed to leave our homes again and we can do one of these in person together, which is going to be great. What do you sense is going to happen? Like, where are we going to be a few months from now? And Noelle, as somebody who runs a company and is going to have to hire and recruit people, maybe you go first.
I was actually, right before this, I was drafting an email to all of our member companies and the startups we work with kind of on this topic. And frankly, like, I got about one paragraph in and I was like, what is it going to look like in 6 to 12 months? And I don't think there are very few people out there, I think, who could credibly state a view on that. From my perspective, I think we will be hiring for a different profile of person, I think, as we fill roles. My hope is we won't need to hire a lot of people because we'll be able to retain our team through this crisis. But I think that the digital engagement aspects of what we're doing are really going to shift the way that our team grows in the future, in terms of just selecting much more in favor of people who are really passionate about programming, conversations like this one in person and digitally, and who kind of have that ability to switch between the two, which is something that's been on our radar for a while, but I think that will definitely come to the fore. And I also think people will be coming out of this with that skill set. Like, I don't know how many people in my network who, like, frankly, I was surprised, like, could use FaceTime, especially my family, are now, like, sending me Zoom meeting invites for, like, happy hour or dinner on Friday or something. So I don't know. I think that you're just going to see that more and more as a skill set anyways. But,
okay.
Stephane,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, one other thing that I've been thinking about is we've been looking at ways to help our team kind of find balance in our cadences at work, because scaling a company can be pretty intense, and we're very committed on the work-life balance side to making sure that it's a sustainable work environment for people. And I do think that the other thing that we've learned is we really can do remote. And so giving people more flexibility around that will be a shift that we'll be making even after we're back in the office. And then something we didn't talk about, but that I'm curious to hear people's views on, is like, we've talked a little bit about teams that are like remote first and then teams that are in person first. We have a team where the bulk of our employees are in one location, but then we have mission critical teams that are distributed, and they're very small. They're typically like dyads or triads in our different locations. And that is really hard to manage too. So figuring out a way to really promote the experience of our remote teams, because it can be so hard to be like 2 people dialed into a Zoom call and then it's a room of 30 people drinking beer, talking to each other, like what's happening. So that's another thing that we'll be adjusting, I think, when we resume what is hopefully business as usual.
Got it. Okay, Stephane, what do you think?
I would say good news, bad news. So here's I think
always good news, bad news with you.
Yeah, but let's start with the bad news, because otherwise I'm going to be blamed for talking about COVID 2025. So the bad news is we're going to go into pretty deep recession, and it's going to take a long time to recover from it. And the reason why that is because the epidemic is only going to last a few months, but there's going to be an economic impact with directly just lots of job losses, businesses that close, and that's going to take a lot longer. And then from that, there's a financial crisis that comes out of it. And, I would say if you just talk about the tech sector, which, a lot of us are part of the tech sector here, people are struggling with their investments. So that has an impact on the limited partners, the people that invest in venture capital, who are pulling out like crazy right now. And I know a number of funds that are trying to raise and are really struggling to raise money. And because the GPs of those funds don't have enough money to play with that they thought, they're not investing in as many startups as they were going to. And even the startups they have invested in who need to raise more capital, they're going to have to pick the winners and let a lot of companies die. And that is a multi-year impact, right? So this is not going to be a V-shaped, where it crashes quickly and then it goes back quickly. This is going to be much more like an L shape. Crashes really fast and then takes a long time to recover. That's the bad news. The good news is historically, these are amazing opportunities for entrepreneurs, and the next wave of huge, incredibly successful US-based companies is going to come from this. 2001 was, Google and eBay and LinkedIn and PayPal and, all of these companies. 2008 was Uber and Airbnb and Instagram and, dozens and dozens of others. And 2020 is going to be a new batch of those. It's going to be harder for people to raise money, but it's also much easier for entrepreneurs to stand out. It's easier to attract talent now than it was. It's easier to do PR because, journalists are not inundated with 50,000 press releases from every startup that's being funded. And fundamentally, you're just going to be able to shine and grow much faster than you would otherwise. So I think it's going to take longer than I think people think. It's not like, oh, we're going to be back at work in 3 weeks and then everything's going to be great. But, if you fast forward, like 2-3 years down the road, I think we'll have a new wave of incredible companies that will continue to drive innovation and the economy moving forward.
Got it. Okay. Let's see, Peter, you go. You went last before, so I won't make you go last again.
So similar to, I think, what a lot of people have already shared and hinted at is that I think there's going to be a significant period of soul searching and existential reconsideration, if you will. Companies are really going to start to look at this and say, how are we oriented? How are we doing business? What is really required of our workforce to be done on site in a proximate way, or what can actually be shifted off and done remotely? And I think that in turn, similar to what was mentioned earlier by Noelle, I think that's going to favor a lot of remote applicants who before might not have been considered are now going to have a much better chance of competing for those positions. So I think there'll be kind of a smoothing out, if you will, of the playing field in advantage of those remote workers. I think that's one thing. Another issue that we brought up earlier about this idea of productive serendipity, I really think that cannot be overstated, just how important that is, both within organizations, but also externally. People just getting together for a drink after work, meeting up, at an industry gathering or whatnot, sharing ideas, not necessarily coming with any set agenda or talking points, but learning about what somebody else is working on and then kind of riffing on that, then riffing on that and iterating out from there. I think companies are going to have to be very intentional now about thinking, how do we provide those opportunities going forward? And whether it's through things like this, whether it's through virtual meetups or even virtual happy hours, which I've gotten now 3 different requests to go to virtual happy hours tomorrow. So I'm really excited to participate in that. But I think companies are going to have to be very thoughtful and intentional again about allowing and creating an arena for those kind of productive moments of serendipity to happen.
Cool. Andrew, what about you?
I agree with Stephane that we're likely headed into a recession. This is not just going to be a quick bounce back, but people need to remember that recessions are not a reason to panic, and it's not the end of the world. Even during the Great Recession 10 years ago, which was the worst since the Great Depression, I often ask people when I give talks, I say, how much do you think the economy shrank during the Great Recession, which was such a disaster? And people will raise their hand and say 30%. It shrank about 4%, you know, and unemployment hit 10%, not 25%. So for most people, they will not be affected. Like, the impacts of recession are highly unequal. Some people's lives get totally dismantled, and some people actually just enjoy lower prices and sort of stay where they are in their jobs, and it's fine. But I think for employers, the hiring landscape is going to change dramatically. For years, all I've been hearing is how hard it is to fill tech roles and find talent, especially in data science and in AI and other hot fields. That's going to change. They're going to see a lot more applicants for jobs, and that's going to mean employers are going to be needing tools to filter through and to find the gems in that pile of applicants.
Got it. Okay. Well, it's not the end of the world. Feels like about as hopeful a place as we can possibly expect to land on. So let's do that. Thank you all so much for being here. This has been awesome. Thank you to the dogs for hanging out with us.
Yeah.
I'm unbelievably upset that we didn't see more pets on this call. That's my one note for next time, more pets. But really, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. We're going to do a few more of these over the next few weeks. So stay tuned. And again, thank you all so much for being here, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you, David and Lauren. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.